In November of 1910, 6 of the most powerful men in America boarded a private train under fake names. They told their families they were going duck hunting. They were not. They were heading to a remote barrier island off the coast of Georgia, an island that had been quietly bought up and sealed off from the public years earlier. And for 9 days, behind locked doors, they drafted the document that would create the Federal Reserve. Jekyll Island. That is where they went. The history books tell you it was just a quiet hunting retreat for the very wealthy, a coincidence of climate and privacy, a nice little clubhouse on the Georgia coast where rich men went to shoot ducks and ride horses. But the deeper you dig into Jekyll Island, the stranger it gets. Because long before the Rockefellers and the Morgans bought this place in 1886, the island was already considered sacred ground. The mounds were already there, the bones were already there. And the question nobody in mainstream history seems willing to ask is this: why did the architects of modern American finance choose to draft their charter on top of a burial site? If you find this kind of buried history fascinating, hit that subscribe button right now. We dig into the stories the textbooks left out, the ones that connect the dots between forgotten civilizations and the men who built the modern world. Now let's get into what they really chose Jekyll for. Long before any Europeans set foot on the Georgia coast, Jekyll Island had a different name. The Gual people called it Ospo. The Timucua, who lived on the mainland just across the marsh, knew it as a place of the dead, not in a metaphorical sense, in a literal one. Archaeologists working the island throughout the 20th century kept finding the same thing in different layers of the sand. Burial mounds, shell rings, human remains arranged in patterns that suggested ceremony, not accident. The earliest of these sites date back at least 3,000 years, and possibly much longer. The official record admits to roughly 4,000 years of continuous human presence on the island. But the dating of the deepest shell middens and the lower soil layers tells a story that is older than that, and significantly stranger. Some of the shell rings on the Georgia and South Carolina coast are now believed to be among the oldest monumental structures anywhere in North America. Older than the pyramids at Giza, older than Stonehenge. And we still do not have a clean answer for who built them or why they built them in the precise circular patterns that they did. What we do know is that the entire coastal stretch from Jekyll up through Sapelo and St. Catharines was treated by indigenous peoples as a corridor of sacred ground. The dead were brought here, ceremonies were performed here. The land itself was understood to hold something the living did not casually disturb. The Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 1500s noted in their journals that the natives held these islands in a kind of reverent silence. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They did not build their main villages on Jekyll. They visited it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. In nearly every ancient culture across the world, the places where the living lived and the places where the dead were honored were kept separate. Jekyll was the second kind. A threshold. An island of transition. A place that was meaningful precisely because it was set apart from daily life. When the Spanish friars catalogued the indigenous customs of the Georgia coast in the late 1500s, they wrote of long ceremonial processions. The Guale and the Macama would travel by canoe across the marsh, carrying the bones of their dead wrapped in woven mats, and they would lay them in the island earth at specific times of year. The friars described the practice as superstitious. Modern archaeologists describe it as one of the most sophisticated mortuary traditions on the entire eastern seaboard. Either way, the island was treated as a destination, a receiving ground, a vault for the dead. Now fast forward to 1886. A group of 53 of the wealthiest men in America pool their money and quietly purchase the entire island for $125,000. The official story is that they wanted a private retreat, a place to hunt, to ride, to escape the New York winters and the eyes of the press. The membership roster of the Jekyll Island Club at its peak included names you already know: J.P. Morgan, William Rockefeller, Joseph Pulitzer, Marshall Field, Vincent Astor. The combined wealth of the membership was, at one point, estimated to represent 1/6 of the total wealth of the United States. 1/6. Concentrated on a single barrier island off the Georgia coast. They built a magnificent clubhouse with a Queen Anne turret. They built private cottages along Riverview Drive. They installed the first transcontinental phone call from the island in 1915 with President Wilson on the other end. And they kept the place absolutely closed to outsiders. No journalists, no politicians who were not invited, no public records of what happened there beyond what the members chose to share. What the club brochures and the official tourist materials do not advertise is what these men actually did when they arrived on virgin ground. They built directly on top of the existing mound system. The clubhouse, the chapel, the early cottages, all of them were placed on land that had been documented by surveyors as containing human remains and ceremonial earthworks. Several of the mounds were levelled. The bones were either reburied quietly elsewhere on the island, or in some cases simply removed and lost. Photographs from the construction period show workers excavating sites that we now understand were ceremonial in nature. The men who owned Jekyll Island knew exactly what was underneath their feet. The state of Georgia had already conducted early archaeological surveys. The information was available to anyone who asked. They built on top of it anyway. Here is where the story gets stranger and where the Tartaria question enters the conversation. If you spend any time looking at old photographs of the original Jekyll Island Club building, something feels off. The architecture is too refined for what is supposedly a hunting lodge on a remote island in the 1880s. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The masonry on certain foundation walls predates the construction date the club officially claims. There are stone elements on the island, particularly near the old Tabby ruins on the south end, that do not match the established timeline. Tabby is a building material made from oyster shell, lime, sand, and water. Mainstream history says it was used by Spanish colonists and later by enslaved Africans during the plantation era. But some of the tabby structures on Jekyll Island appear to have layers that predate the documented Spanish arrival entirely. The dating is, of course, disputed by the academic establishment. There is one particular ruin on the island, sometimes called the Horton House Foundation, that researchers in the alternative history space have argued shows construction techniques inconsistent with 18th century colonial work. The walls are too thick. The orientation aligns with celestial markers that colonial settlers had no documented interest in tracking. And the foundation goes deeper than it needs to for a simple coastal residence. We are not claiming the entire island is a Tartarian outpost. What we are pointing out is that the official story of Jekyll Island has gaps, big ones, and those gaps tend to appear in exactly the places where the 1886 club members chose to build their headquarters. Which brings us back to November of 1910. Senator Nelson Aldrich, Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan and Company, Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Charles Norton, President of First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong of Bankers Trust, and Aldrich's private secretary, Arthur Shelton. They arrived under fake first names. Aldrich became Nelson, Davison became Henry, Warburg became Paul. They were instructed never to use surnames in front of the staff. Even the duck hunting guns they brought with them were unloaded because none of them actually planned to hunt. They were on the island for one reason: to write the framework of what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act. The question that historians have asked for over a century is, why Jekyll Island? Why not Newport? Why not a private estate in the Adirondacks? Why not Aldrich's own mansion in Rhode Island? The conventional answer is privacy. The island was already closed to the public. The members trusted each other. The staff signed agreements of confidentiality before that term was even common. But there is a second answer that the deeper history researchers have been circling for years. The men who met in 1910 were not just choosing a private location, they were choosing a meaningful one, a site that had been considered powerful for thousands of years, a burial ground, a threshold, a place where the old indigenous tradition said the veil between worlds was thinner than usual. Whether or not you personally believe in that kind of thing, the men in question almost certainly did. The late 19th and early 20th century elite were deeply involved in occult and ritual societies. Skull and Bones at Yale, the Theosophical Society, the Bohemian Club, which famously meets at Bohemian Grove, another wooded site with indigenous ceremonial history that nobody really likes to talk about. The pattern is consistent across the historical record. The financial and political architects of the 20th century chose again and again to gather on land with pre-Columbian sacred significance. This is not a fringe observation. The Bohemian Grove sits on land that the Pomo people considered ceremonial. The Vatican is built on top of a Roman necropolis and what was very likely an earlier Etruscan ritual site. Washington, D.C. itself is laid out over a network of earthworks that the original Algonquin inhabitants used for their own gatherings. The wealthy and the powerful have always done this. They build their institutions on top of older institutions. They place their meetings on top of older meetings. The question is whether they do it for cosmic reasons or whether they do it because they understand something about the land that the rest of us are not supposed to understand. Jekyll Island fits the pattern perfectly. The 1,000-year-old mounds, the level burial sites, the clubhouse that sits exactly where the Guar once honoured their dead. And then, in 1910, the founding of an institution that would shape the financial fate of an entire civilization, drafted by men who arrived under false names and left no minutes. There are no official records of what was said in those 9 days. No minutes, no transcripts, no notes preserved in any archive. The only accounts we have come from memoirs written decades later by the men themselves, and those memoirs were carefully scrubbed of anything that might have implicated the broader plan. Frank Vanderlip eventually admitted in a 1935 article for the Saturday Evening Post that the secrecy was deliberate. He wrote that discovery, simply by being known, would have killed the legislation in its cradle. So they hid, on an island, on top of a graveyard. The Aldrich plan that emerged from the meeting became, with modifications, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Within 3 years of that meeting, the United States had a central bank that would in turn fund both sides of the First World War. Within 20 years, that same central banking system would oversee the Great Depression. Within 100 years, the dollar would lose more than 95% of its purchasing power. You can blame economic forces. You can blame human error. You can blame the natural cycles of empires that rise and collapse. But you cannot deny that the place where it all started was a sealed island built on the bones of a vanished civilization that no history textbook will name. Today, Jekyll Island is a Georgia state park. You can tour the clubhouse. You can walk the historic district. There is a small plaque acknowledging the 1910 meeting, but it is treated as a minor footnote of Gilded Age tourism. The official tour guides will tell you about the millionaires and the duck hunts and the horse-drawn carriages. They will not tell you about the mounds. They will not point out which buildings sit on top of which burial sites. They will not mention the tabby ruins that do not match the dates they are supposed to match. The shell rings are still out there on the marsh side of the island, slowly being eroded by hurricanes and rising sea levels. The bones, the ones that were not removed during construction, are still in the ground. And the financial system that was drafted above them is still running, still expanding, still operating in ways that almost nobody fully understands or controls. Whether you call it Tartaria, or you call it forgotten indigenous history, or you simply call it the convenient pattern of how powerful men have always chosen their meeting places. The truth about Jekyll Island is the same. The story you were told in school is the polished version. The real story is older, darker, and buried, quite literally, beneath the floorboards of one of the most consequential rooms in American history. If this is the kind of buried history you came here for, the video on screen right now goes even deeper, into the pattern of elite gatherings on sacred sites across the world. Click it, we will see you there.